Kimbolton Castle, January 1536. The damp stone walls absorb the piercing cold, and the silence is broken only by the wind, mourning someone outside the window. In this raw silence, far from the splendor of the court and the warmth of human affection, a life is fading. Before us is a 50-year-old woman who looks all of 70. Once, her beauty drove poets to madness, and her will struck fear into her enemies. Now, of her former greatness, only a shadow and an unyielding spirit remain. Beneath the thin fabric of her nightgown, hidden from prying eyes, a coarse hair shirt chafes her skin. This is not a sign of penance for sins. It is her eternal, silent reminder of sacrifice, of a marriage that became her Golgotha. The crown she once wore with triumph has turned into an invisible, white-hot band, searing a brand upon her soul. He called it duty. He called it a necessity of state. Once, he had called it love. But the most terrible secret of her suffering was revealed only after her death. When the physician performing the autopsy looked inside, he found that all her organs were healthy. All but one, her heart. It was entirely black, as if scorched from within not by poison but by a grief beyond human measure. How did the daughter of Europe's greatest monarchs, the most educated princess of her time, the courageous regent of England who defeated the Scots, end up here, alone, in exile, with a heart blackened by suffering? To understand how the crown became her curse, and love her most sophisticated weapon, we must return to the beginning, to a time when her story was not yet a tragedy, but a great promise of glory. Her story began not in silks, but in the saddle. Catherine, or Catalina, as she was known in her homeland, was the daughter of two warrior monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who had united Spain with fire and sword. The clash of swords was her lullaby, and the scent of gunpowder the fragrance of her childhood. She watched as her mother, the great Isabella, personally led troops, and she absorbed with her mother's milk a simple truth. A woman could be not just an ornament to the throne, but its steel foundation. She was given a brilliant education, available only to princes. She spoke Latin as fluently as her native Castilian and was well versed in theology, philosophy, and politics. But most importantly, they forged a core of pure Spanish steel within her soul, an unyielding faith. Faith in God, in duty, in her own destiny. It was this faith so clear and absolute that gave her strength. She did not yet know that one day this very same faith would become the bars of her personal prison. At the age of 3, her destiny was bound to England, betrothed to the heir, Prince Arthur. It was a union not of hearts, but of crowns. But when the young bride and groom began to correspond in elegant Latin, politics may have given way to something more. In one of his letters, Arthur wrote ecstatically to his parents, "I am overjoyed to behold the face of my lovely bride. No woman in the world could be more beautiful." Their marriage was as brief as a flash of light. Just 5 months of fragile happiness in a damp Welsh castle, and then fever, delirium, and death. Arthur, the hope of the Tudor dynasty, burned out in a matter of days. At 16, Catherine was left a widow in a foreign land. And here began her first true trial. 7 years of humiliation. Her father-in-law, the miserly Henry VII, unwilling to return her rich dowry, kept her in England in a state of limbo. She lived in poverty, falling into debt to pay her servants, and wrote desperate letters to her father. "I would choose to be in the sea at the mercy of the waves than to endure such torments again." Who was she now? Not a wife, not a widow, not a princess. A political asset that had lost its value. These years hardened her, teaching her to endure, to wait, and to believe against all odds. A skill that would, in the future, push her to the very edge. And then, in 1509, the old king died. His younger son ascended the throne, the 18-year-old Henry VIII, young, dazzlingly handsome, full of life and ambition. A knight from a legend, stepped from the pages of a romance. And this god in the flesh, upon whom the entire court gazed with adoration, made his choice. He ignored all the princesses of Europe. He wanted only her, Catherine, his late brother's wife. "I will marry her," he declared decisively to his council. "It was my father's dying wish." And perhaps his own most fervent desire as well. In an instant, her 7 years of suffering were over. She became Queen of England, the adored wife of Europe's most eligible monarch. It was a fairy tale come to life. Her faith had been rewarded. It seemed that only happiness lay ahead. But fairy tales never tell you what happens when the prince stops loving you. The first years of their marriage were bathed in sunlight. Catherine was not just a wife, she was his closest companion, his philosopher queen. They read together, made music, and prayed together. Henry, young and inexperienced, looked at his wife, who was older and wiser, with undisguised admiration. He trusted her completely. In 1513, when he left for war in France, he left England in her hands, appointing her regent, and she did not disappoint. When the Scottish king, believing a weak woman ruled the kingdom, invaded England, Catherine showed the world the blood of her mother. While 7 months pregnant, she personally donned armor and rode north to inspire the troops. Her army won a crushing victory at the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish king was slain. With the triumph of a victor, she sent her husband in France a blood-soaked scrap of the enemy's cloak with a defiant message: "Sire, I send you this in place of banners. Thus you will see how I keep my promise." She was at the peak of her power, a warrior queen worthy of her king. But there was one war she was losing, the most important one, the war waged on the battlefield of her own body. The primary duty of a queen was to produce an heir, and Catherine tried desperately to fulfill it. But her body, as if cursed, betrayed her again and again. One pregnancy followed another, but each ended in tragedy. A stillborn daughter, then another miscarriage. Each loss was not just a personal grief, but a blow to the stability of the throne. The court whispered. The king grew somber. The pressure mounted, turning her bedchamber into a torture chamber of hope. And then, in the new year of 1511, the heavens seemed to take pity. Catherine gave birth to a son, a healthy, crying boy, an heir. England rejoiced, wine flowed freely, and celebratory bonfires burned across the country. Henry was beside himself with joy. He held the most magnificent jousting tournament in honor of his wife and the little Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall. At last, their dynasty was secure. Catherine had done her duty. The happiness lasted for 52 days. The infant died suddenly for no apparent reason. This death broke something in both of them. In her, a piece of her soul. In him, his patience. She kept trying. More pregnancies, more hopes, and more losses followed. In 1516, she gave birth to a healthy child, a girl whom they named Mary. Henry adored his daughter, boasting of her intelligence and talents. But every time he looked at her, he saw not only his favorite, but also the ghost of the son who never was. She was a princess, not a prince. Years passed. The stress, the endless pregnancies, and the grief left their mark on Catherine's face. She gained weight. Her beauty faded. Henry, however, was in his prime, hungry for life and, increasingly, desperate for an heir. And then, one of his mistresses, a young lady-in-waiting named Bessie Blount, gave birth to a healthy, strong boy. Henry not only acknowledged the bastard, he gave him the royal name of Henry and the title of Duke of Richmond. It was a devastating blow, a public humiliation. The king was declaring for all to hear, "The problem is not with me. I can have sons. The problem is with her." Catherine, loyal, pious, and devoted, had to endure this as well. She prayed more fervently, fasted more strictly, as if trying to beg God's forgiveness for a sin she had not committed. She found a fragile peace in accepting that Mary would be the heir, and dedicated herself to her daughter's upbringing. She believed the worst was over, that the king had resigned himself to fate. She was wrong. While Catherine sought solace in prayer, his wandering gaze fell upon one of her own ladies-in-waiting. a girl with eyes darker than night, a defiant smile, and a will that rivaled the Queen's own. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and she offered the king something Catherine could not just a son, but the illusion of a new, clean start. And for that illusion, Henry was willing to burn their entire world to the ground. Henry, blinded by passion and desperation, found what he was looking for. Not in his heart, but on the dusty pages of the Bible, in the passages one only consults when seeking divine justification for entirely earthly desires. The book of Leviticus stated, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." Childless. They had their daughter Mary, but to a king obsessed with an heir, she did not count. He had found his loophole, a holy license for betrayal. And with this, he came to her, to the woman who had lived with him for 20 years, who had carried his children, ruled his country, and prayed for his soul. He came and declared that their entire life was a mistake, a sin, a curse in the eyes of God. Imagine her shock. The husband she loved, with whom she had shared a bed, joys and sorrows, the father of her only child, was suddenly telling her she had never been his wife, that all these years she had been living in sin. This was not just a betrayal. It was an annulment of her very self, a murder of her past, an erasure of her entire identity as a wife, a mother, and a queen. But the steel forged in her soul did not break. It bent, but it held. "I am your lawful wife," she answered him firmly, looking directly into his eyes, where coldness now rippled instead of former love. "And I will prove it before the entire world." And the world came to watch this trial, the trial of a love. In May 1529, the flower of England gathered in the Dominican monastery of Blackfriars, cardinals in purple, bishops, the king's counselors. The air in the hall was heavy with the gravity of the moment. Henry delivered a speech full of false piety, speaking of the sufferings of his conscience. And then they called for her, Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England. She entered the hall, not as an accused woman with her head bowed, but as a queen, head held high, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting. She listened to the accusations in silence, and then she did something no one expected. She violated all courtly and judicial etiquette. Ignoring the judges on their dais, she walked across the hall and knelt. Not before them, before him, before her husband and her executioner. And in the ensuing silence, her voice, trembling with pain but full of dignity, sounded like a verdict against him. "Sir," she began, every word addressed only to him, "I beseech you for all the loves that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice. Take of me some pity, for I am a poor woman and a stranger born out of your dominion. Alas, sir, wherein have I offended you? What cause of displeasure have I given? I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. These 20 years or more I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had divers children, although it hath pleased God to call them out of this world. And if ye can prove the contrary, I am content to depart, to my shame and rebuke." She fell silent. Slowly she rose, gave him a low curtsy, and without another glance at anyone, walked towards the exit. A court officer leaped to his feet. "Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court," he cried out 3 times. She turned at the very threshold. "It makes no matter," she replied loudly for all to hear, "for it is no indifferent court for me, therefore I will not tarry." And she left. It is said the crowd outside greeted her with cheers. She had won the battle for the people's hearts, but the war for the king's heart she had long since lost. After this farce, their life together became a hell of silence. They still lived under the same roof, but an invisible wall, colder and thicker than any castles, had grown between them. Sometimes they dined together in public, maintaining a facade of propriety, and this icy politeness was more terrifying than open hatred. The palace filled with ghosts, the ghost of their dead marriage, the ghost of Anne Boleyn, whose presence was felt in every corner. And to Anne's fury, Henry still demanded that it be Catherine, his non-wife, who continued to mend and sew his shirts. This strange, intimate ritual was the last thread connecting them to their past, and he refused to sever it. The end came suddenly and mundanely. On July 11, 1531, Henry left for a hunt, as he often did. But this time he never returned to her. He did not even wake her to say goodbye. For him, she had already ceased to exist. Ahead of her lay the final, most cruel trial. Exile not only from the court, from her title, from her entire past life, but also from the one thing that still gave it meaning, from her daughter, her blood, her Mary. She was exiled, not just from the court, but from her own life. It was not merely a demotion in status. It was a public erasure of 23 years of her life, her marriage, her motherhood. Stripped of the title of queen, she once again became the Dowager Princess of Wales, a ghost from the past, a living reminder of a marriage the king wished to expunge from history. Her journey into oblivion was slow and humiliating. She was sent from one castle to another, each more secluded, more damp and dilapidated than the last. From the luxurious chambers of Greenwich to the gloomy walls of Buckden, and then to her final refuge, Kimbolton. Her world, which once encompassed all of England, shrank to the size of a few rooms with perpetually damp tapestries, where her every move was watched by the hostile eyes of servants appointed by Anne Boleyn. But Henry had prepared a torture for her far more sophisticated than poverty or isolation. He separated her from her daughter. He took Mary from her. The girl, the Princess of England, was not only declared a bastard and stripped of her place in the line of succession. In an act of monstrous humiliation, she was sent to serve in the household of Anne Boleyn's newborn daughter, Elizabeth. Mother and daughter were forbidden to see each other, forbidden to correspond. Henry knew where to strike. He could take her crown, her wealth, her freedom. But only by severing this sacred bond could he truly break her. Or so he thought. From time to time, he would extend the key to her cage. Royal envoys, old associates like the Duke of Norfolk, would arrive with offers full of venomous generosity. "The king is merciful," they would say in honeyed tones. "He desires only your good sense. Acknowledge the new order of things, and you and the Princess Mary will have your honors and comfort restored." The price for the key to her cage was her soul, and the soul of her daughter. To agree meant not only to betray her faith, but to forever brand her own daughter as illegitimate, to break her spirit, to strip her of all her rights. And Catherine's answer was always the same, spoken in a quiet but unbreakable voice. "I am the Queen of England, his true wife, until God should decide otherwise, and the Princess Mary is his lawful heir." Her connection with her daughter became an act of treason. Every letter, written on a scrap of paper and secretly carried out of the castle by a loyal servant, could cost that person their life. But they continued to write. In these letters, Catherine was not just a mother. She was a general, preparing her only soldier for the decisive battle. "Daughter," she wrote in 1534, "I heard such tidings this day that I do perceive, if it be true, the time is very near when Almighty God will prove you. And I am very glad of it, for I trust he doth handle you with a good love." She taught her to see suffering not as a punishment, but as a divine test. She was forging in her daughter the same steel will she herself possessed. It was then that her secret burden, the hair shirt under her dress, became her only true companion. It was her shield. Every prick of the coarse wool against her skin was an answer to Henry's verbal barbs. Every discomfort was her personal rebellion against the comfort offered in exchange for betrayal. It was her way of saying to him, to Anne, and to the entire world, "You can break my body, but you will not touch my soul." She had voluntarily imprisoned herself in a fortress of her own principles. By the end of her life, in Kimbolton Castle, she rarely left her room. She went out only for Mass. She spent her days in prayer in the cold, drafty chapel, kneeling on the icy stone floor for hours. She ate almost nothing, her body withered. She was preparing to meet the only king she now recognized. Her body, exhausted by grief and illness, began to fail, but her will remained indomitable. In the winter of 1535, the woman who had been Queen of England prepared for her final battle. And this time, her opponent was not a king, but death itself. Winter 1535. Within the damp walls of Kimbolton, the last spark of hope is dying. News that the former queen is on her deathbed reaches the court. The imperial ambassador, the loyal Eustace Chapuys, is granted permission to visit her. Henry is merciful, but this mercy held a drop of poison. He allows the ambassador to say farewell to the dying woman, but he denies the same comfort to her daughter. Even on her deathbed, Catherine would not receive the solace of seeing her only child. But there was one woman whose loyalty could not be stopped by royal decrees or palace guards. Maria de Salinas, her Spanish lady-in-waiting, her friend for life, rode dozens of miles across the frozen land to the castle gates. When she was refused entry, she resorted to a ruse, pretending she had fallen from her horse and was in desperate need of shelter. The deception worked. Loyalty had found a way through betrayal. It is said that in her final hours, as her breathing grew shallow, Catherine dictated a final letter to Henry. Its authenticity is disputed, but the words that have come down to us burn with tragic tenderness. "My most dear lord, king, and husband," she whispered, "the hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me to commend myself to you and to put you in remembrance of the health and safeguard of your soul. I forgive you all, and pray God to do so likewise. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things." Perhaps it was her final act of Christian forgiveness, or perhaps it was the final, most subtle weapon of a woman who knew that guilt would haunt her tormentor forever. On January 7, 1536, her suffering ended. When the news reached the court, Henry and Anne Boleyn dressed in celebratory yellow. On that same day, Anne suffered a miscarriage. She lost a boy. So how did she end up in that cold room, far from everyone she loved, with a heart blackened by grief? She ended up there because she refused to become someone else. In a world of political deals and flexible morals, her principles were absolute. Henry seared his crown's brand upon her, expecting her to break. He mistook the steel of her faith for the fragility of pride. He never understood that for Catherine, to surrender, to betray her daughter and her God, was more terrifying than to die. Her personal defeat triggered the birth of a new church and changed the course of English history forever. Her daughter, for whom she sacrificed everything, would eventually take the throne. This is the central paradox of her life. Dying in obscurity, she won an invisible victory that echoed through the centuries. Henry VIII took everything from her, her husband, her child, her crown, but he could never take her soul. And in the end, the story of Catherine of Aragon is a story not about the crown he placed on her head, but about the one she carried with unyielding dignity inside her blackened but unconquered heart.